Okay, people are still coming in. That's fine. Get yourself a drink and something to eat and find a seat. So firstly, my name is Paul Gross. For those that don't know me, I'm a senior fellow here at the Begin Centre. Usually at this time, or around this time on a Wednesday, I'm hosting an event on Zoom, and I think some of the people in this room are regular attendees of those virtual events. If you would like to... Oh, that's a great reminder. Thank you. That's really helpful, actually, because that reminds me to ask everyone to switch off their phones. Including me. My phone went off under the chuppah. That's a true story. That's a true story. Almost instant divorce. Yeah, that was not good. Where was I? So, if you would like to be on my mailing list and receive information about the English events that we do, both here in person at the Begin. Let's check if it's recording. Okay. We're also recording for people that couldn't make it tonight. I did it here a few years ago when we had elections in, I guess, 2019. Little did I know that I'd be doing it again now, and it would be 5 elections on from that. So, yeah, it's kind of crazy even by Israel standards. And I want to stress that the purpose of this event is to inform you as much as possible about the system here, because I think for a lot of people, especially olim chadashim, especially new immigrants, it's very confusing. And also about the parties and the issues. Now, I'm not neutral personally, and there's no one in Israel who is neutral. Speak to a taxi driver about the politics or elections, and that you'll get their views. But I've been doing this kind of thing for a while, so I'm pretty well versed in presenting a non-partisan analysis of the situation. If anyone feels I'm being unfair to a particular party or issue, then by all means raise it, challenge me. That's fine. But as I said, my intention is to inform you and for you to be able to reach election day with a better understanding of the issues and a better sense of who you might want to vote for. I'm sure this is a diverse group of people with your own issues that are important to you, your own values and other things. So you'll come away from this and make your own decisions based on those things. And also, when you read whatever news source you read about Israel, whether it's Jerusalem Post or Times of Israel or Haaretz or whatever else, hopefully you will be able to do so with a little more knowledge after this evening. All right, so I've got a pretty detailed presentation here, but in many respects, the most important bit of this evening is the questions from you. So stop me with questions as we go. If I think there's too many questions and I'm not going to finish, then I might say let's leave it for a little bit. But by all means, raise questions if something isn't clear, and at the end we'll have time for more questions about some of the things that I've raised. So let's start with the basics, and I apologize for anyone for whom this is too basic. But my sense is that for at least some of the people in this room, this is useful. Israel's system is very different from certainly those of you from the United States. This is obviously completely different. And even those of you from other parliamentary systems like Canada or the UK, it's also somewhat different. So we have multiple parties in Israel. That's not news to you, I'm sure. Not just 2 like the United States or even countries like Britain that have several parties. There's usually two main parties. That's not so much the case here, or at least not these days. We currently have in the current Knesset, the Knesset that will be replaced on November the 1st, essentially. We currently have 13 parties in the Knesset. 8 of them sit in the government coalition. 5 of them are in the opposition. That's the current state of play. There are 120 seats in the Knesset. Does anyone know why, by the way, there's 120 seats in the Knesset? Why? Yes, right. Knesset Gedolah. Yes, the Great Assembly. Right. It's a very deliberate reference to ancient Israel, which is very interesting. Actually, a lot of contemporary political commentators think it's a mistake that it's far too small. That most countries of a comparable size have far more members of parliament, and that actually there's too much work for the individual, for 120 members of parliament to do, but that's another story. We won't get into that now. So we have 120 seats, and they are divided after each election directly in proportion, or more or less directly in proportion to the number of votes cast. So in Israel, you do not have constituencies or districts or ridings. The country is not divided into geographical areas from which you elect a member. Okay? The entire country is one big electoral district, and then when you vote, the number of votes cast directly translates to the number of seats that each party gets. So very simply, if you have a party that gets 25% of the votes cast, that party will receive 30 seats in the Knesset, right? 25% of 120, okay? Even my very basic maths can get that right. Now, in theory, elections are held every 4 years. Right now, that sort of provokes particular amusement. But even before this crazy period, it was unusual for government to last that long. What usually happens is the government collapses before that time has elapsed. And the reasons government collapse can be multiple reasons, but essentially because every Israeli government is a coalition of parties, it's never one party. It's never one party, because the way a government is formed in Israel is after the election, you look at the results, and then usually the largest party is given the job, the responsibility of trying to form a government by bringing together other parties into a coalition, so that coalition can reach a majority in the Knesset. So a minimum of 61 seats in the 120-seat Knesset. 61 is that magic number that has to be got. So following election results, so unlike in the United States or Britain or many other places, the day after the election, you don't know who the new prime minister is going to be or the new government is going to be, because because you have a whole process afterwards of coalition forming. So the day after the election, party leaders negotiate to form a government, right? So just to give a kind of simple example, let's say the Likud, which has been the largest party in recent years, okay, Benjamin Netanyahu's party. Let's say the Likud is the largest party. So in order to form a coalition, Netanyahu has to get to 61 seats. There is no possibility that he gets to 61 on his own. That has never happened. Okay? Even in the days when parties reached, when you had really dominant parties that got to help yourselves to something to eat or drink and take a seat. Even in the days when you had very dominant parties that might get to like 40 seats or something, that nothing even approaching 61 by themselves. So Netanyahu would have to basically get other parties on board. How does he do that? By offering them certain things, right? So you offer party leaders and other senior figures ministerial positions, and you also offer to accommodate their policy goals. So the classic example is with the ultra-Orthodox, right? The Haredi parties, right? So there are two Haredi parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, and these parties are famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, for playing the game brilliantly, right? So they know exactly what they want. They have very, very, very specific demands, and they will say to whoever is the likely to be the prime minister, if you will give us what we want, that is, for example, funding for our yeshivot. You're stuck behind a pillar, madam. Do you want to move? Are you okay? Okay. Funding for our yeshivot, funding for our schools, a continuation of the exemption from the army, all kinds of things. We don't need to go into the controversies here. These are controversial issues in Israel, but this is the reality. And so, once that kind of horse trading is done, then you get, hopefully for the party leader in question, he can get to 61, and that's how a government is formed. Now, it sounds relatively simple. In reality, it isn't, and has become increasingly complicated in the last few years, and we'll get in the last, literally this period. that we're talking about now, this period that we are now in, where we are approaching election number 5 in 2.5 years. And I'll say a little about that in a minute. Okay, a little bit of history, not very much. I don't want to go into huge detail. Not everyone will be interested, but I think it's useful for some people. Yes, sir, question?
What is the minimum threshold that a party needs to achieve?
Okay, so very good. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. You're absolutely right to say. So, okay, so let me just say quickly now, and I'll go into more detail later. The gentleman is right to mention the electoral threshold. So it is not the case that any party that gets any number of votes gets represented in the Knesset. There is a threshold of 3.25%, basically enough for 4 seats in the Knesset. Okay, any party that gets below that number is simply not represented, and their votes are wasted. Okay. Which has become very, very consequential in recent years, and probably will be again this time around. Okay, so let me say a little something about this. So it used to be the case until probably around 13, 14 years ago that most Israelis would reliably vote for 2 major parties. Right? You had a major party of the right, the Likud, a major party of the left, which used to be the Labour Party, and before that, previous sort of names for the same party, but essentially let's call it the Labour Party for the purposes of simplicity. And the vast majority of Israelis would vote for one of those 2 big parties. And then you had other smaller parties which might lean more right or left, but could, in theory, be up for grabs for either party. If they needed a coalition. Now, this is obviously very, very different from a 2-party system like the United States. But just to make it a little clearer, perhaps, for those of you used to a 2-party system, imagine if let's take the American case. Imagine if the Israeli system were transplanted into the United States, which would be a shock for everyone. But let's say that happened. So what would happen is you have 2 parties. You have the Democrats and the Republicans, but the Democrats and the Republicans would be, one would be this is the mainstream kind of liberal party, the mainstream conservative party, but then you'd have other smaller parties that would be kind of single issue parties. So you might have like parties on the right that would say, I don't trust the Republicans to be tough enough on protecting the Second Amendment, let's say. So then you'd have a party that's specifically single issue about Second Amendment rights, okay, or pro-life, or some other issue. And the same on the other side, okay? And then those parties would be, some people would either decide to vote for one of the 2 big parties, Democrats or Republicans, or they might decide, no, this issue is really, really, really important to me, and I'm going to vote for one of these smaller parties because I really want to strengthen the power of that lobby, of that particular issue. So that's kind of how it works. You have also, if it were really similar to the Israeli system, you'd also have sectarian parties. You'd have parties that represent particular demographic groups. You might have you might have an African American party or a Hispanic party. I don't know, but you see what I mean? So in Israel, you have Arab parties, for example. And of course, as just mentioned, you have the ultra-Orthodox parties. Now, I've divided sort of this kind of political history into 3. So you had this period at the beginning, and this is the question of left and right, because left and right in Israel these days usually means something different to what it means in most other places. Usually left and right in most places is talking about the size of government and higher taxes, lower taxes, spending more versus spending less on welfare, all these issues that we're familiar with. And the first little under 30 years of Israeli history, it was pretty similar here. You had a very dominant labor movement, socialist party, and other smaller socialist parties that supported it. And then you had the Herut party, which became the Likud party, which was a free market party. And by the way, of course, some of you may know that the labor movement is dominant in Israeli politics for the first 30 years of the state. Only in 1977, nearly 30 years after the state is formed, does Menachem Begin become prime minister, and you have what's called the Mahapach, the turnabout in Israeli politics, and the switch from left to right, and the Likud become the dominant party, and Begin is prime minister. And here, some of you may know, this is Ben Gurion and Begin, the two sort of legendary figures in their respective political movements. After 74, left and right come to mean something else. They come to be about your positions on the increasingly important and increasingly divisive issue of what to do with the territories liberated in 1967. Okay, Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, and Gaza, and what to do with the people who live there. Okay, the Palestinians who live there, and what to do about about Jewish settlements that are being built there. And that whole question comes to define increasingly into the 80s and to a point of fever pitch in the 90s with the Oslo Accords, and then of course the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. Okay, and then left and right come, and from there and up to this day, most Israelis, if they were to define themselves as Smolani or Yemani, left or right, they would be talking about their position on that issue. Okay, most Israelis who would define themselves as left-wing would be referring to their position, would be referring to their opposition to Jewish settlement, their support for a Palestinian state, etc., and right-wingers the opposite. Okay, that tends to be what we mean. And the terminology usually used in Israel is peace camp versus national camp, which I think is a little unfair, because clearly right-wingers can also be very supportive of peace, and left-wingers can also be very patriotic Jewish, Israelis. But this is the terminology that has come to be used. And then in 2009 we have a change, and I would say that in every election since 2009, pretty much, the Palestinian issue and the issue of territory has really not been a major issue at elections, which would have been crazy for Israelis to think about a few years before that. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, which we don't need to go into in great depth, but essentially it's because of a sort of growing consensus in Israeli society that whatever one thinks about that issue, and whether one wants to see a two-state solution or one is absolutely opposed to that, it's not going to happen anytime soon anyway. So let's deal with other issues. Okay, so what it becomes to be about is elections are different, but things, in fact, in many ways, Israel became a more normal country politically in that sense, because the elections tend to be about the things that they're about in other countries, the cost of living, and whether you want more money spent on education and healthcare and things like that, right? And those tended to, and they came to the fore much more in the elections after this period. And then personality politics became a major issue, and specifically in the last 3-4 years, the personality of Benjamin Netanyahu, partly because it would probably be the case for anyone who's been prime minister as long as he has. He's in Israel's long. He's not. I still have to get used to the fact he's not prime minister right now. Right, that's how long he was prime minister. It's still, I have to do like a kind of double take that he's not currently Israel's prime minister, but he is Israel's longest serving prime minister. Okay, he was elected. He was first elected way back in 1996, and was just in power for 3 years, and then he was gone. He was gone for a decade. Not gone literally, but gone from the Prime Minister's office. He was re-elected in 2009, and then he was in power until he was unseated last year, right? So he overtook Ben Gurion as Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister. So in some respects, anyone who was Prime Minister for that long would probably come to become a dominant figure and a divisive figure in certain ways. But he also became divisive for other reasons, which we can go into, not just political, but also in things in his personal life, the court cases that are against him. He's currently on facing three corruption charges. So these are obviously issues which hugely divide the country, to the point where, in many respects, Netanyahu has become the sort of dividing issue in Israeli politics. And we'll say a little more about that as we go on. All right. So let's look at the Knesset. This is the Knesset that we that we're saying goodbye to in a couple of weeks. So after the elections of March 2021, those were the results. A bit later I'm going to go through the parties and who they are. Don't worry about that. But for now, let's look at this, at these parties. Now, firstly, I want to say a little about the electoral threshold that was raised earlier by the gentleman at the back. So as I said, 3.25% is the threshold, and if you get below that, then you don't make it in. And that has a lot of, as I said, that can be very, very consequential. So just to give an example, right now, so we have, if you look at this, there are two Arab parties currently in the Knesset. The Joint List with 6 seats and Ram with 4. Now, it used to be the case that Ram was part of the Joint List. Ram split from the Joint List for a bunch of reasons, which we can go into. But Joint List is, Joint List, it itself is made up of 3 separate parties. We now already know that in this coming election, the Joint List is split further, and there's another party that's running independently from the Joint List called Balad. These are all Arab parties. Why is it significant? Because Balad there's a very, very good chance, according to current polls, that it won't get into the threshold, which means a few things. One, it means that the Arab representation will be smaller. It also could mean that that's very good. It could be very good news for Netanyahu, because the Arab bloc is in the anti-Netanyahu camp. So given how tight things are, given that we're talking like 1 or 2 seats could determine whether the pro-Netanyahu bloc wins or the anti-Netanyahu bloc wins, the loss of one party not making it in one bloc or the other could basically swing it. Could make the difference between Netanyahu being prime minister or not being prime minister. So that's very critical. Now, let's say something about these blocks. So these are the results of the elections. Now, what happened after these elections? You'll notice the blocks are very important. Likud is the largest party after those elections, by far, by almost twice as much as the second largest, 30 to 17. But Netanyahu was not able to reach that magic number of 61. Okay, he couldn't get to 61. Now, the parties in blue are the parties that are foursquare behind Netanyahu. Likud, of course, his party, Shas and United Torah Judaism, the Haredi parties, and religious Zionism, a religious right-wing, very right-wing party, let's say. Now, the grey parties, blue is the anti-Netanyahu, right? These are the, red. Red is anti-Netanyahu, right? So the red parties, these are parties that said, under no circumstances will we sit in a coalition with Netanyahu. Not the Likud, Netanyahu. Meaning, in theory, if it was a different leader of the Likud, then at least some of these parties would have no problem. It's very specific about Netanyahu.
That's why they're red, because they're angry.
Potentially. Right, so these are the anti-Netanyahu. Now look at the grey, look at the ones in grey. Yamina, which is another right-wing party, Naftali Bennett's party, and Ram, which, as I said, is an Arab party. Now Ram, unusually for an Arab party, said, we're gonna play it a little differently to how Arab parties have done it in the past. In the past, Arab parties have said, we're not going to sit in any coalition government because something along the lines of you're all as bad as each other. They had some preferences. They certainly tended to somewhat prefer the left-wing parties to the right-wing parties, but they didn't like any of the Jewish Zionist parties, right? So they're not going to sit in a coalition with them. Ram and its leader Mansour Abbas broke a taboo and said, no. I'm going to do what the Haredim do. I'm going to see if I can get a good deal for my constituents, Arab voters, from whoever is willing to offer that to me, whether it's Netanyahu or someone else. So you had this strange situation where Ram was essentially up for grabs, and even Netanyahu, as the right-wing prime minister, was negotiating with him. Yamina right-wing party, so you think pro-Netanyahu. But firstly, there's some personal issues going on there. Bennett and Netanyahu have a long and very antagonistic personal history. And Bennett said, let's see. Firstly, Bennett, before the election, said that he wanted to be prime minister. Little did he know how realistically that would... I don't think he actually imagined that could happen. But there you go. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The Knesset's supposedly 120
Yeah.
with 13 parties.
Yeah.
Most of those parties do not have democratic primaries like in the United States.
True. That's true.
So in some way, it's the number of things in the Knesset is 13, with some of them more powerful than the others in terms of votes. Because, if you're a junior person in Bennett's party,
Yeah.
you'll have no choice how to vote.
In theory, although Davka and Bennett's party, there were people who actually caused the coalition to fall by rebelling against the party. So there is...
You can only do it with political suicide.
You're right. That's true. That's true. I don't want to get into this too much, but I would actually say that one of the problems with the Israeli system is that even in those parties that do have primaries, I think it's very hard for individual members to go against the party leadership in all kinds of ways. I think it's much. For example, in Britain relatively recently, the prime minister was basically forced out by his own party. It's interesting that hasn't happened in Israel with the Likud, even though most Likud members know, whatever their personal views of Netanyahu, most of them know that they would be in government if they had someone other than Netanyahu as prime minister, as leader, right? But it's very, very difficult for them to go against Netanyahu. So I think even in the case of those parties with primaries, it's hard. Okay, so. So we had this situation. Now, what happened was Netanyahu, as you can see, if he got, he was on 52. If he got Yamina and Ram, he gets above 61, right? Yamina gets him up to 59. Ram then gets him up to 63. Problem is, firstly, Ram aren't sure if they want to sit in a coalition with these guys. And these guys are absolutely positive they don't want to sit in a coalition with Ram. So the mutual exclusion, if you like, of Ram, an Arab party, and religious Zionism, a very right-wing religious party, effectively prevented a Netanyahu coalition last time around. So then you're left with this anti-Netanyahu bloc. Now, in theory, you think, okay, great, 57, all they need to get is one of these and they're sweet. The problem is, of course, that unlike Netanyahu's bloc, this bloc is incredibly diverse, right? You have Yesh Atid as a kind of centrist party, also blue and white, Labour and Meretz on the left, Joint List is an Arab party, Yisrael Beitenu is a kind of hawkish party, New Hope is a right-wing party made up of Likudniks who had enough of Netanyahu. So it was the idea that this group of parties could form a coalition was seen as very unlikely until, of course, it happened, as we know. And that was the big sort of shock to the Israeli system in many respects. And this question of how long would this last? Would it be able to go the full... certainly, the full 4 years was a little optimistic for anyone, I think. But I think the fact that it lasted a year was probably in many people's predictions, that it would go about a year and then collapse. Other people thought it might even collapse before that. But essentially, that was this sort of unusually diverse party that was formed. Now, the big surprise was that they were willing to put aside their differences, and this is the same diagram, but this was the coalition that was formed, right? So you had Yesh Atid with 17, blue and white 8, Labour. Now, can anyone notice a discrepancy here? Sharp-eyed. Okay, I don't want to waste too much time with this, but you'll see that Yamina, Bennett's party, got 7 seats, and yet here it is in the coalition with 6 seats. Why is that? Because one of the members of Yamina protested this coalition and essentially left the party. He didn't leave the Knesset. He didn't resign from the Knesset, which he could have done. He didn't resign from the Knesset. He stayed in the Knesset and basically was an independent member of Knesset, voting primarily with the opposition against the coalition. Sorry?
That's permissible?
That is permissible. It's frowned, like, I would say that he made a lot of enemies in doing so. But yeah, there's nothing to stop him from doing that. As an independent member, there were certain things he couldn't do. I forget exactly. I think he's not allowed to be a member of certain high-profile committees in the Knesset because he's not affiliated with a party and things like that. But he can still sit in the Knesset and vote. His name's Amichai Shikli. This time round, by the way, he's on the list for the Likud. He's running with the Likud. So we had this coalition. Just one second, I'll come to you. And as we know, Naftali Bennett started out as Prime Minister with just, ultimately, 6 seats, which is unheard of in Israeli history, right? Usually, in almost every case, it's the leader of the largest party. In maybe 1 or 2 cases, it's been the second largest party. But a party with 6 seats? Now, this was a consequence of this very, very, very unusual coalition. And essentially, it was let's put it this way. The price that the left had to pay for this coalition was to give a right winger the prime minister's position. Right? It's basically there are 2 explicitly right wing parties, arguably 3, but let's say 2 explicitly right wing parties in this coalition, Yamina and New Hope. And they said, if we're going to sit in this coalition with all of you people that disagree with us fundamentally on things like settlements, okay, and the Palestinian issue, and a few other things, then you're going to have to give us the top job, right? So the agreement was a rotation. The agreement was a rotation between Bennett and Lapid, and had it served its 4-year term, you would have had Bennett for the first 2 years and then Lapid taking over 2 years later. What ended up happening was that, as we know, the coalition collapsed, and part of the agreement was that if the cause of the party that causes the collapse is a right-wing party, then Lapid gets the prime minister's job automatically. Okay, which is what happened. It was Yamina members who quit the coalition and caused the government to collapse, and so Lapid became prime minister. And that's why Lapid has, since the collapse of the government, Lapid has been the interim prime minister until elections. Yes, sir, you had a question.
So we like to say that Israel is a democratic country, democracy,
Yeah.
but it really doesn't seem to be the case, because
In what
with
sense?
the coalition building system, you have one party, and then you don't know what's going to happen.
Okay.
Because the core party designates who's going to come into the coalition, and nobody knows that. So where's the democracy in this? And also, doesn't the basic law say that no one is allowed into the Knesset if they preach overthrow of the government, which the Arab parties clearly do?
Okay.
Where's the democratic features?
Okay. So two comments there. Two comments there. Firstly, on the democracy question. Look, Israel is a democracy in the sense that, firstly, it's democracy in other ways as well. Democracy isn't just about elections. I think that's very important to say. But let's take the elections bit. Israeli citizens all have a vote, and their vote is their vote is expressed in the makeup of the Knesset. And then, having expressed their opinion through voting and essentially creating the makeup of the Knesset by their votes, then those parties, the system says, those parties then have to get together and form a government. Now, that's, by the way, the case in many other countries as well. Like, it's not just Israel. A lot of countries in Europe have similar parliamentary coalition systems, with some variations and some things that make it more stable than Israel's. But it's not dissimilar. By the way, are you from the United States, sir?
Yes.
Right. So, look, a non-American could say, look at the Electoral College. Like, look at the fact that there's been however many presidents elected without without winning a majority of the vote. I'm not making that argument. I'm saying that you can look at different democratic countries and say there's something in that system which renders it not as democratic as we would like. I could look at, if you see, what was the last one? Trump, Clinton, right? So you could look at the number of Americans voted for Clinton, whatever it was, number of Americans who voted for Trump, whatever it was. Many, many more Americans voted for Clinton, and yet Trump's president. Like, I could look at that and say, what the hell? So, again, I think you can make argument, you can pick holes in how democracies do that. I think the point is that everyone knows the rules of the game. It's not like, this isn't a surprise to anyone. Every party is playing by the same rules and knows this is how it works. On your second point, you mentioned the basic law which you said which does not allow for the overthrow of the government. So what you're referring to is a basic law passed which says that a party is not allowed to enter the Knesset if it does one of three things. One, if it advocates, if its platform, if its party platform, not random comments made by people, right? But the specific platform of the party either explicitly advocates racism or denies Israel's Jewish character or denies Israel's democratic character. One of those three things. Now, you are right to say, and many do make this argument, of course, that the Arab parties almost certainly do not recognize or support, let's put it that way, Israel's Jewish character. Although, interestingly, Mansour Abbas explicitly did recently, which was was a kind of game changer in all kinds of ways. But you're right to say that. And so there's a lot of argument as to why they haven't been kicked out. I don't want to get into it too much, but basically there's quite a high bar. Let's put it that way. The Supreme Court sets quite a high bar for what a party has to have very, very explicitly in order for it not to run. It also goes the other way as well, right? That we can get into it, but Itamar Ben-Gvir's party is allowed to run despite the fact that many would say they advocate racism. So it's that they're a Kahanist party or whatever. So it can go the same way. But I take your point. It's certainly the case that many people claim that this law, the law you mentioned, is not implemented as it should be. That's absolutely the case. That is an argument made probably at every election, I would say. Okay. Right. So this is where we are with this. So let's go on. So let's get to the coming election. Now, the two most likely candidates remain the leaders of the two largest parties, both the two largest current parties, Likud and Yesh Atid, and also the two largest parties, according to polls, most likely largest parties in the next election, Netanyahu of Likud and Yair Lapid of Yesh Atid. Benny Gantz of Blue and White, or now his party's changed its National Unity, we'll get to that, is a kind of dark horse, and I'll explain why in a minute. Now, Bibi's path to the Prime Minister's office is the most straightforward, right? He has a settled bloc of four parties that support him, as I said, his own party, the Likud, also Shas and United Torah Judaism, the Haredi parties, and Religious Zionism, which is the party of Bezalel Smotrich. And they all back him. He also has Bennett is quitting politics, right? So his party, Yamina, is now gone back to a former name. This is always very confusing in Israeli politics when names change. But essentially it's Yamina. It's called Bayit Yehudi, the Jewish Home Party, which was its original name a few years ago. And it's now led by Ayelet Shaked, who was Bennett's deputy for many years.
It's not by choice. It just seemed like they wouldn't win any seats.
Right. So this is the thing. So now unlike under Bennett, who, as I said, was kind of a little vague about whether he would support Netanyahu, and in the end, of course, ended up being part of the anti-Netanyahu camp. Shaked is widely expected to support Netanyahu. So if her party does well, even reasonably well, then Netanyahu is almost certain to get to 61. Because at the moment, he's polling, his bloc is polling somewhere between, at the low side, 58, and at the high side, 61, sometimes 62, rarely 62. But that's without Shaked's party. So if Shaked's party is there, then he pretty much gets over the line. She hasn't said she'll go with him for sure, but she hasn't said she wouldn't, and most people assume she would. And another minister who originally formed the party with her left. Most people think because he didn't want to go with Netanyahu. Yes.
How reliable are the surveys?
Not. Oh well, actually, let me be a little fairer. So I think they're good at giving a general sense. So I think the fact that the polls tell us that the blocks are kind of tied at the moment, like 60-60 or 61-59 or 62-58, that's probably accurate. That's probably accurate. The specifics of the parties themselves, those are often wrong. Those are often wrong, and I think it's partly because it's quite a small sampling size a lot of the time, and it's not just in Israel that polls have been wrong, as we know. Right? There have been famous cases of polls being wrong in other countries, Brexit in Britain and Trump in the US and other things. I think they're broadly right about the blocks, but maybe not about the specific parties. Yeah.
I remember reading that the polls were saying that Ayala Chapek might not even make it.
Yes. So then
that becomes very important because
Exactly.
if people think she's not going to make it, they won't vote for her because they don't want their vote to be wasted.
Right. So here's the interesting thing, right? Because you might think that it's in Netanyahu's interests to have a lot of people voting for Shaked, because then she gets in, and then, as I said, he probably gets over the line. But actually, up to now, it might change before Election Day, but up to now, the Likud have actually been very dismissive of her and have been, I would say, trying to persuade people not to vote for her. Can anyone think why that might be?
Because then they'll vote for other people on the right.
Right. So it's a very, very difficult judgment call to make. If you're Netanyahu, the judgment call to make is Shaked, if we get lots of people to vote for her, and she gets over the line and gets 4 seats, great, I'm Prime Minister. But if we get lots of people to vote for her and she falls just short, then thousands of votes, of right-wing votes, have been wasted, and it will probably lose him a seat or two. Right? So at the moment, and maybe the Likud have done their own polling, and this is what they're going on. But at the moment, it seems like their money is on her not making it, and so they're quite anxious that people don't vote for her. That people rather vote for other right-wing parties. Their assumption, of course, is that people that would otherwise vote for her, if they don't vote for her, would vote for one of the parties in Bibi's bloc, which is probably true of most, although I'm not sure of all. Yes, she absolutely has apologized. Yes, that's right. She has apologized. Now, if we look at Lapid, he has a much more problematic situation, right? Because he would need to be, even if his bloc gets to 61, he would need to build the same kind of diverse coalition that he did last time. And there's no guarantee he'd be able to do that. And we're talking about, again, we're talking about a group of parties that is united primarily by their desire to stop Netanyahu, and I would add this because I think it's important, and I'll say more about it later, not just to stop Netanyahu because it's Netanyahu, but also to prevent the government that Netanyahu wants to form. Okay, that there are many people, one of the things that unites Lapid, Merav Michaeli of Labour and Zav Galon of Meretz, and Gantz and Saar on the sort of, let's say, centre right, is a belief that the potential Netanyahu coalition will be very damaging for Israel. Okay? And this is something we're hearing increasingly as elections coming about. We're hearing this more and more from those people. You know, I'll get to it. Now, Gantz. So, Gantz is the leader of a, and I'll say this in a little bit when we talk about the parties. Gantz is the leader of this kind of new merger between his Blue and White Party and Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope Party, and it's called the National Unity Party, I think it's called in English. In Hebrew, it's called, what's it called in Hebrew? It has a slightly better name in Hebrew, though not much better. A Machaneh Mamlachti. Okay, so it's kind of difficult to translate. Mamlachti is a kind of untranslatable word into English, but it kind of means, it denotes like national responsibility, sort of patriotism and national responsibility. Now, what Gantz claims, Gantz's claim is that he's in the anti-Netanyahu camp, but he says, unlike Lapid, I can bring the Haredim on board. His claim is that Lapid would, if we look at Netanyahu's bloc, you're obviously not going to get the Likud, fair enough, and you're not going to get religious Zionism, who are further to the right. In theory, the Haredi parties could be up for grabs, because historically, as I said right at the beginning, they have been. Right? Historically, the Haredi parties have been willing to go with right-wing and left-wing governments if they get certain things. Now, Lapid has a very antagonistic relationship with the Haredim going back many years, because his party, Yesh Atid, was founded partly on opposition to Haredim not serving in the army and other things, that other sort of issues where Haredim were seen as taking from the state and not giving, right? And this was a very big slogan of Lapid's in the early days. So the Haredim are not big fans of Lapid, and it's unlikely to imagine that they would serve under him as prime minister. But Gantz, firstly, personally, like literally, Benny Gantz himself has good relationships with the Haredi members of Knesset. That's not nothing. And also, Gantz himself is a traditional Jew. I wouldn't say religious, but he's a traditional Jew. Okay, he lays tefillin, he goes to shul. He's a traditional Jew, and so he can speak their language in a way that Lapid certainly can't. Yeah.
The member of the opposition, the party that's most anti-Haredi is Lieberman,
Right.
which is the Russian party.
Okay, so we'll talk about Lehman's party.
You lose one if you.
Yeah. It's a really good point. So it's true, and up to this point, Liebman's party have said they wouldn't sit with the Haredim. So you're right. Unless Gantz were able to get both Haredi, if you got both Haredi parties, that would be enough to compensate for losing Liebman's party. But if you just got one, it wouldn't be enough. You're right. All right. So let's actually look at the parties. So this is the kind of. So these are the parties running this time round. I have not included parties which have no chance whatsoever of clearing the electoral threshold. There are dozens and dozens of parties that run in elections here. Okay, most of them receive a handful of votes. If the Pirate Party, right? There's all kinds of crazy parties that when you go to vote. For those of you that haven't voted in Israel before, I should have said this at the beginning. For those of you that haven't voted before in Israel, when you go into the voting station, the polling station, it's called a kalpi, you will see in front of you rows of little petakim, little slips of paper with the names of the parties and also letters that represent those parties. And you choose one of them, put it in an envelope, put it in the box, and you voted. It's very low tech, no electronic voting in Israel. But you'll see loads of parties, and most of them you won't even have heard of. Right, so some, as I said, some crazy sort of, just I don't know. People get some funny ideas about starting a party, but these are the parties that are either definitely going to make it in, or at least stand a chance. So we can say, so currently, for example, Jewish Home, which is Shaked's party, and Balad are polling below the threshold. Currently, these two parties, if the polls are right, would not get in. But I'm including them here because they could get in, right, theoretically. All right, so let's just say a little bit about the parties. There's a lot, so I'm really going to whiz through them. And if anyone has specific questions about particular parties, then I'm happy to answer them afterwards. So we'll start here on the left. Yesh Atid. So as I said, this is started by Lapid, Yair Lapid, who was a former journalist, initially setting themselves up as a party really on issues around the cost of living and this issue of the Haredim not pulling their weight, essentially, in the state. Lapid is always at pains to define himself as a centrist, not a leftist.
It's a two-state.
He supports two states, but he differs from left-wing parties in a couple of ways on that. Firstly, he doesn't put it front and center of his issue set. Also, and increasingly the case since the Abraham Accords, he very much believes that a bilateral negotiations with the Palestinians don't work because you can't trust the Palestinians, and so you need the buy-in from neighbouring Arab states. So he would want to see a negotiations which in a sort of more comprehensive negotiations which include neighbouring Arab states. He's also against the redivision of Jerusalem, which again would I think distinguish him from the left on specifically on that. But that's not the main thing he talks about. As I said, they focus on cost of living, investment in health and education. They try and talk they try and talk to the Israeli middle class. Let's put it that way, like sort of Israeli middle class interests. They've since the whole Netanyahu court cases, they've also been very big on cleaning up corruption and clean government and that kind of thing. And also, and this is increasingly the case, I think, as we get closer, and Lapid's bloc is going to start talking about the danger posed by the Netanyahu bloc, which I'm going to get to, which you asked about. He's also a defender. He's also a defender of Israeli democracy, as he would define it, and we can get to that. Now, Labour, traditionally the historic founding party of the state, right? The party of Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin and Moshe Dayan and many other people that you will have heard of. Very much these days a shell of its former self, certainly in terms of its influence and power. It's these days led by Merav Michaeli, who's also a former journalist. So basically the mainstream left-wing party supports two-state solution, negotiated peace with Palestinians, opposed to settlement building, believes in larger government in terms of larger government role in reducing the cost of living. And also, actually, one thing that I would say that connects Yesh Atid with Labour and also with Meretz is they're all kind of, I would say, socially liberal. They're liberal on things like women's rights, women's issues, gay rights, things like that. Meretz, the most left-wing Jewish party, led by Zava Galon. They have they're similar to Labour in lots of respects, but I would say Labour has more of a kind of traditional Israeli sense of the importance of security, I would say, in a way that Meretz don't. I don't want to besmirch anyone or anything like that, but Meretz, for example, like Zava Galon, the leader of Meretz, said recently that Benny Gantz, the defense minister, has to stop IDF soldiers from being so free to to fire at Palestinians. That too many innocent Palestinians are being killed in incidents in the territories. Now, I think Labour would say, let's let the IDF do its job. Right? There's a kind of difference there, in a nuance, shall we say? Arab parties. I might be going out on a limb by saying that no one here is going to vote for one of these parties, but I don't want to make too many assumptions. But I don't want to spend too much time on them, primarily for that reason. But I will say that there are differences between them, and it is important not to not to sort of say, oh, the Arab parties are all the same, because they're not any more than the Jewish parties are all the same. It's just the fact that because of their size and because of the electoral threshold, they had to group together as the joint list in order to stand a chance of getting into the Knesset. But there are important differences between them. Ram is the party of Mansour Abbas. As I said, they are now the real outlier Arab party that has kind of broken the taboo of willing to serve in an Israeli government. And crucially, they made the decision to focus almost exclusively on Israeli Arab issues and not the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, right? Which is very, very important, right? Because previously Arab parties have seen themselves not just as the parties of Israeli Arabs, but of all Palestinians, right? Because they would also define themselves, at least many of them, would define themselves as Palestinians, and so they would say that they'd also be very critical of Israeli military operations and this kind of thing. Abbas said, no, that's not our fight. The people that vote for me are Arab citizens of Israel, and those are the people I'm going to represent. And that was a huge break from what had gone before, and essentially really opened the door for him to enter the government, and as I said, even initially enter into negotiations with Netanyahu. As I said, Balad are running separately this time round, which, as I said earlier, could have consequences, because if they fall under the threshold, that could make a difference. The Likud, switching to the other side. So Likud, the most successful electoral party of Israel for the past 40 years. Centre-right party, the party initially of Menachem Begin. Look, when a party's been in power as long as Likud has, since '77 when Begin first came into power, the Likud has been in office for most of the years since then. Okay, either under Begin or Yitzhak Shamir or Ariel Sharon or Netanyahu, right? 4 Likud prime ministers. The Likud today, I think it would be fair to say, is not the same as the Likud of Menachem Begin. The extent to which that is true determines how people respond to him. So, for example, you have some people who claim that he's moved so far away from the Likud of Menachem Begin that we don't have anything to do with it anymore, and they leave the Likud. And that was Gideon Sa'ar and others who left for New Hope, and some others, including Menachem Begin's son Benny Begin. Others say, yeah, it's different from Begin's Likud, but so what? The Labour Party is also different from Ben Gurion's Labour Party. That's what happens. Like, parties change. Like, it's not such a big deal, So these are issues. But this is a party which is supportive of the settlement movement, more or less, I would say. The caveat is that some on the right would criticise the Likud for being too pragmatic over the years, right? So one of the reasons why some on the right have not voted for Likud but have chosen to vote for parties further to the right is they think that the Likud has been too willing to compromise on its ideology, specifically on that issue. But essentially that they're supportive of the settlements. Netanyahu, by the way, in 2009 made a famous / infamous, depending on your view, speech in which he endorsed two-state solution. He's rowed back since then. Right? So I think it would be fair to say that Netanyahu today is not supporting two states, unless you're talking about like the two-state deal that Trump offered, which Netanyahu did support, I think, which many people didn't think was a serious offer for various reasons. One other important thing to say about this party, its voters are very, very loyal. Right? One of the reasons why the Likud has done so well is that it's established I think like a lot of successful parties in a lot of countries, it's established a almost a tribal mentality among its voters. So there are people who will vote for Likud no matter what. right? In the same way as I think maybe in the countries that you come from, there are people who are like, I'm a diehard Republican or Labour Party or Conservative Party or Liberal Party or whatever, and I'm not going to you're really going to have to force people to confront certain real significant changes in the party's platform in order to convince them to change their mind, because it's part of their identity. Sorry?
No, I'm sorry, you didn't even mention party system of practice. I said sometimes the war should start so people will stop thinking. I'm sorry.
Russia, you said? Yeah. Okay. So Russia's a different system, slightly different. Let's just say you can vote, but you know the result before the election is gone. So I think that's important as well, and that's a very key part of Netanyahu. That's a very key part of Netanyahu's success, right? That people have thrown all kinds of accusations at him. Some of them have stuck, some have not stuck. It's very difficult to imagine a scenario where the Likud really plummets. It might lose a few seats, which is important, right? It could be the difference between Netanyahu becoming prime minister or not. But Likud isn't going to suddenly plummet to down to being the third or fourth largest party, because there's a real sort of loyalty among the base for Likud. Wait, we'll say that. Just go to this question.
Is there a blue-collar, white-collar divide among the supporters of immigrants?
Okay, that's a really good question. So yeah, I mean, it's not exact, and there are also subdivisions based on religion and some ethnic affinities and other things. But yeah, the truth is that the Likud from Begin on has got a lot of the blue collar votes. It's counterintuitive maybe when you think of left and right, but think of it this way. Where are you from, the United States? So think about blue collar. This isn't an exact parallel, but let's think about blue collar Americans in the South who vote more on cultural issues than. Do you know what I mean? It's a similar thing. Likud speaks their language, I think, in a certain way. Also, Netanyahu. Another way in which Netanyahu is different from Begin. Begin was a free market. He was a capitalist, free market guy, but as opposed to the very explicitly socialist Labour Party. In current parlance, he wouldn't be seen as particularly capitalist, I don't think. He was much more he definitely believed in the government role in healthcare and education and providing welfare. It was definitely not, certainly in the American sense, he would not be a kind of Republican fiscal conservative. Whereas Netanyahu is much more of a Reaganite, Thatcherite free marketeer. He very much believes in that.
So where does Gans and Lapid sit on that issue?
Okay, so we'll get there. So they're next. There you go. They're next. So national unity, this merger of Gantz and Gideon Sa'ar. So it's probably easiest, first of all, to say something about them separately. But so Blue and White was this party that was formed by Benny Gantz, who basically walked straight from his role as Army Chief of Staff, IDF Chief of Staff, into politics to become the leader of this party, Blue and White. And it was a very personal party. It was a party based around Benny Gantz. It was kind of odd. It was a little like Benny Gantz. The IDF has a position in Israeli society which nothing else in Israeli society does. So whenever you see the list of institutions in Israel and the public's view of them, whether it's the Prime Minister or the President or the Knesset or the judiciary or the police or whatever, or often almost all of them have very low levels of trust, except the IDF. The IDF consistently has very, very high levels of support and trust in Israeli society, which means that the IDF Chief of Staff except in very, very rare cases, is almost automatically a popular figure in Israeli society. So when Gantz walked into politics without any political background and without anyone knowing that much about what he thought, he was instantly very popular. And people saw him as a leader figure because they liked the idea of this kind of this tall, general who spoke in this very blunt, sort of army manner. It spoke to a lot of Israelis. And Blue and White initially, they didn't have a political platform of their own. And they merged with Yesh Atid and effectively adopted Yesh Atid's platform. And Lapid agreed to let Gantz be the leader of this party because he saw that Gantz had a better chance of doing well in the elections than he did because of Gantz's military background and everything else. A lot's happened since then. They split. Gantz went with Netanyahu. He had his fingers burned by that experience. And now Gantz is kind of presenting himself as a sort of tough, pragmatic. There's a phrase in Israel called, from the word for security, bitachon, a bitachonist, right? Someone who primarily sees things through a security lens, right? He's a kind of security is his main, is a thing he's kind of mainly focused on. He's defense minister after all, but he also has, he also talks about, the importance of improving Israeli education, and making Israel a stronger country, not just militarily, but also in terms of the the sort of the education of its youth and these kinds of things. And he is joined with Gideon Sa'ar, who founded New Hope. Sa'ar's an interesting figure. I will come to you. Sa'ar's an interesting figure. He was a long-time Likud minister, and a dyed-in-the-wool Likudnik, like ideologically, like really like for as long as he was involved in politics as a teenager, he was part of the Likud movement, and he left the Likud to join to create this new party, New Hope, and he basically said, the Likud is no longer the Likud that I joined. This party, the New Hope, is what the Likud used to be, and he brought a bunch of people with him from the Likud to form New Hope. It didn't do as well as he hoped in the last election, but he and him and Gantz, I think, have decided that it makes sense for them to have this party together. That they'll do better electorally. Maybe, could well be right. But it's basically this new party then is presenting itself as a pragmatic centre-right party, a kind of home for Likudniks who don't like Netanyahu, and I guess who are not, who also are less right-wing than those that would vote for parties to the right of the Likud.
Do they favour two-state?
This is an interesting point. So Sa'ar definitely doesn't. In fact, Sa'ar's right-wing credentials on this are probably more reliable than Netanyahu's in many respects, like more consistent, let's say, than Netanyahu's. One of the things, by the way, Sa'ar said when Netanyahu called him, when Netanyahu called him a leftist for joining the government, Sa'ar responded that Netanyahu voted in favour of disengagement, and Sa'ar always opposed it. So I would say Sa'ar has a more consistent right-wing record on this than Netanyahu. Gantz has in the past come out in favour of two states, but he doesn't really talk about it. So the assumption is that this party is not really going to get involved. I think, by the way, this is a symptom of what I talked about earlier, which is that this whole issue, the Palestinian issue, is just not really on the table right now. So I think that people in that party might say, yeah, you know what, if Gantz and Sa'ar were really to get down to it on this, they might disagree, but it doesn't really matter because it's not going to happen anytime soon. So we're not going to let that get in the way of the other issues.
Where do they both stand on settlement development?
So Sa'ar is very much in favour of settlement development. Gantz isn't calling for removal of settlements or anything like that. He's not gung-ho on settlement expansion, but he also hasn't come out explicitly against it particularly. Yeah.
But Gantz has also allowed Palestinian developments, villages, settlements, if you want,
Yes.
in the sea area,
Yes.
especially in strategic areas, which will keep Israeli settlements from growing or being connected. And these also both Sark and Gantz have not spoken out against Biden's Iranian nuclear treaty, like Bibi has.
Well, actually, well. I'll get to the Iranian thing in a second. So, firstly, on settlements, on like policy in Judea and Samaria, it's true that Gantz has allowed Palestinian building in Area C. He also allowed for, I think, for Jewish building, as in they were left in the last government. I don't want to get too into this because I'm really not an expert on this particular issue, so I don't want to get facts wrong. So I would suggest you check it up yourselves. But in the outgoing government, you have to remember the makeup of it, as I said, had left-wingers and right-wingers, right? Now, I think it would be true to say that both Meretz voters and right-wing Yamina voters, let's say, had things to complain about in terms of policy in Judea and Samaria. On Iran, the policy of the outgoing government, which includes not just Gantz but also Lapid and Bennett, was to oppose the deal, but not to openly criticize the Americans as Netanyahu had done. You can like or not like it, but that was the decision made. Now, they would say, by the way, that the JCPOA doesn't look like it's happening, whereas when Netanyahu made a big song and dance a few years ago, it did happen.
They make the same excuse for giving all that the marine borders away to Lebanon. Too.
Okay, so the Lebanon issue I don't want to get into too much because it's very complicated. I would say that you're right to raise it as an issue which has come up as a very divisive issue. So if you listen to Netanyahu and his side, they will tell you that this government has basically sort of sold out or made like a terrible strategic mistake with the deal, with this gas deal with Lebanon, and it speaks to their naivety or their lack of experience, or their arrogance, or their willingness to go along with the Americans no matter what, or whatever. And if you listen to Lapid and Gantz, they'll say, no, this was a serious deal which got the buy-in from the Israeli security establishment and was signed off by the IDF and the Shabak and the Mossad, and we're happy with the security safeguards that are in place. So you can read up on it and see the different sides and see who you find more compelling. Is what I would say to that.
I wasn't saying who's right or wrong, but who's
Sure.
left and right.
Yeah, that's true. You're right. Okay, I want to press on. We get really religious Zionist Party. Yes. So also you had a question. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Okay. All right. Let's press on because this is taking a long time. So religious Zionist Party. This is Bezalel Smotrich's party. Bezalel Smotrich, very right wing, religious, former minister. He is admired by many on the right for being personally very smart, like a very intelligent person, and a minister who like knew how to get things done. Criticized by many others for certain controversial statements he has made against Arabs, non-Orthodox Jews, gay people, and others. He's certainly not loved, shall we say, is an understatement, by many. I wouldn't just say on the left, by many who are not on the right, shall we say. His party also includes Itamar Ben-Gvir, who actually is probably these days maybe more popular than Smotrich among a particular milieu of Israelis. Ben-Gvir is a very, very controversial figure. I think it would be, again, because I'm trying to use as neutral language as possible in this for everyone. It's quite difficult, but I would say that many would regard him as far right. Okay, he's a student of Rabbi Meir Kahana, who those who don't know was a former who was elected to the Knesset in the 1980s, was banned from the Knesset for racism in 1988, and was a very controversial figure, American, originally American. Ben Gvir these days has tried to distance himself, actually literally in recent months I would say, has gone to great lengths to distance himself from Kahana somewhat. Yes, he said that I'm not the same person as I was back then, but certainly a very controversial figure. But look, this party is a very ideological right-wing party, very uncompromising on not just on things like settlements and opposition to a Palestinian state, but also on a kind of certain idea of what a Jewish state should look like. Let's say that. Shas and United Torah Judaism, ultra-Orthodox party. Shas is the Mizrahi, Sephardi. Ultra-Orthodox party, United Torah Judaism is the Ashkenazi one. And I think I've already said enough about what their agenda is, what they want to gain. Yisro Beitenu, interesting party, the party of Avigdor Lieberman, who I think could lay claim to being one of the most influential Israeli politicians of the last 10, 15 years. He himself is from the former Soviet Union, I think from Moldova. And his party is interesting because it defines itself as right-wing and was formerly seen as very much in the right-wing camp, but it's not right-wing in some of the ways that you would think. For one thing, it's secular, and actually not just secular, but fights for secular issues. Primarily for the reason that his constituency, which used to be almost exclusively olim from the former Soviet Union, not anymore, but used to be that, it includes not just primarily secular Israelis, but also, of course, a large number of Israelis who are not recognized as Jewish by the State of Israel. So there are all kinds of issues where they see themselves as discriminated against by the religious establishment, by the rabbinate. So Yisro Beitenu has been very antagonistic towards the religious authorities in Israel. And on that issue, of course, it tends to be very different from most of the other right-wing parties. And actually, Lieberman was the one who in many respects, started this whole cascade of elections, because after that first election back in 2019, when Netanyahu thought he had a coalition, Lieberman suddenly said, I'm not going to sit with the Haredim unless they do X, Y, and Z, and they wouldn't do those things, because those things included going into the army, working rather than just taking stipends and studying, and various other things that they weren't willing to do. So he is now, in many respects, one of the firmest opponents of a Netanyahu government. I would say after Lapid, or maybe even equal with Lapid, Lieberman is the most anti-Netanyahu politician in many respects.
To the extent that he would sit with the Lapid government.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. And even with an Arab government, even with an Arab party, because in a previous incarnation of Yisro Beitenu, like you go back maybe 10 years, Yisro Beitenu was being accused by the left of racism because of some controversial comments that Lieberman was making about Arabs being disloyal and other things. So Lieberman was always very hawkish, and still is. Like on security issues, he's still one of the ways in which he would kind of stress his right-wing credentials is that he's one of the most hawkish figures out there in terms of Israeli security issues. Okay, Jewish Home, as I said, Ayelet Shaked's party. Okay, so this is that was centre left, right religious. As I said, this is the divide that really matters. Yeah.
With all your discussion of the economic issues facing Israel, I'm surprised, not just what you said, but anything I've read. It's not really a
You're right.
issue.
You're right.
I don't understand why.
Okay, so it's a really good point. So the economic issues facing Israel have not been front and centre at all. And I think there was a time when they weren't front and centre because everyone was talking about the Palestinian issue. And then, as I said, there were a few years where they were front and center in a way that they hadn't been before. And now, unfortunately, what everyone thinks of Netanyahu, whether you want him to be prime minister or don't want him to be prime minister, whatever, the fact of this focus on Netanyahu means that these things are not being discussed in a way that they should be. I agree. I think it's a big problem.
And he does not present a platform concerning Beitan?
Netanyahu. So Likud was kind of mocked, actually, in recent elections for not presenting a platform at all. Like, literally, there was no party platform. It was just, like, vote for us and get Netanyahu. Like, Netanyahu was the platform. Like, the selling point was Netanyahu as prime minister, right? This time, I think they actually have presented a platform. It's not very strong on detail, particularly. And the economic platform it's kind of, it's like a sort of relatively sort of fiscally conservative, not particularly, like, not libertarian or anything like extreme. It's
very proud of Netanyahu raising the economic life of Israel.
Right. So that's true, but that was Netanyahu as finance minister. Interestingly, you could make a case. One could make a case that despite the fact that he's Israel's longest-serving prime minister, arguably his biggest impact on Israel, or like let's say his most sort of firm imprint on Israel was when he was finance minister in the early 2000s, and he sort of pushed Israel into a market economy in a way that it hadn't been previously, and was lauded by many as a even many that don't like him as prime minister, many were very impressed with him as finance minister. Okay, let's get into this a little bit. Okay, so now let me just say something about this. There was a story yesterday, in which Bezalel Smotrich came out and said that he had a program for constitutional changes in Israel, which would firstly limit the powers of the Supreme Court, and also make the appointment process of the Supreme Court more dependent on the government, meaning that the government of the day would be able to appoint judges, would have control over which judges to appoint. And
are judges appointed for life?
No, they're not appointed for life. They're not appointed for life in Israel. They have a retirement age. They have a retirement age of 70 or something.
But once they're on, they can stay on
until they're retired. Yes. But the appointment process is they're appointed. I don't want to get into it too much, but they're appointed by a panel which consists of government representatives, opposition representatives, and representatives of the judiciary itself. So it's not. So the choices are often a compromise, and the government is not the majority on the panel. Is the point? So Smotrich. So this is one of the changes. The other change would be to change the laws making breach of trust. I'm trying to get it exactly right. Essentially, the laws would be changed so that most or all of Netanyahu's charges would not be charges that would require him to be in court, essentially. Now, Smotrich said that this would not be retroactive, so it wouldn't actually affect Netanyahu. Someone else in Smotrich's party said it would. So we don't know. Netanyahu today made a comment which said that he didn't know about Smotrich's ideas and he's going to examine them. We'll see. The point is, why did I raise this? This speaks to one of the issues that Lapid for a long time, but increasingly also those on the right who are also in the bloc, so Gideon Sa'ar as well, and the people who left the Likud, say that the coalition that Netanyahu wants to form with Smotrich's party and the Haredim will change Israel in a way that will harm Israeli democracy, meaning they will remove checks and balances on the power of the executive. Israel doesn't have checks and balances like the United States does. It has the Supreme Court and not much else. So in theory, if the Supreme Court had its power... Now, there's a big debate about the power of the Supreme Court generally. Saar, by the way, thinks the Supreme Court has too much power. But his reforms would be part of a whole kind of broader constitutional reform. The fact that Smotrich and some in the Likud are focusing just on changing the power of the court leads to the accusation that they want to change the nature of Israeli democracy and make it more something like Hungary, if people are familiar with what's going on or what's been going on in Hungary. I can say more about that, but essentially, to some extent, it's a debate around this Jewish and democratic definition of Israel, right? So it's about where's the balance, right? Should Israel be more Jewish, more democratic? Or, so for example, if you were to ask Meretz, they would say Israel is basically a democratic state, and it has a Jewish majority, and there should be certain things which sort of keep it sort of as a Jewish state, but not religiously Jewish, right? If you ask Smotrich, he would say a Jewish state, and we have elections, so we're a democracy, but we don't need more than that. We don't like other things that we might think of as kind of part of democratic values and stuff. Don't interest him particularly, right? If you asked, I would say, and this is my speculation, by the way, so you can by all means read other people and get different views. I'm giving my perspective. If you ask Lapid, or I would say many in the Likud, actually, in fact, even Netanyahu, a couple of years ago, I think they would say that you don't need to, that Jewish and democratic works because sometimes there's a tension between the two things, but you work within that tension. We shouldn't be giving up or even thinking about giving up on either one of those things. So that I think is part of what the divide is about. And because of Bibi's court case, the suspicion is that Netanyahu is going along with this because it helps him personally, right? That's the accusation, right? That Netanyahu himself doesn't particularly agree with these things, but he's going to benefit from this, so he wants to go along with it. That's the accusation.
Is there an accusation that Smotrich, is going to strip citizenship from Arab?
I don't think that Smotrich. No, I don't think that specific. I don't think that specific thing.
To what effect? We're talking about Bibi's trial.
Yes, but also look. This is speculation, but like in theory, if you don't have any check or balance on the majority, and Israel's a parliamentary system where the executive, by definition, has a majority in the Knesset, then in theory, 61 members of the Knesset could vote to do whatever they wanted, and even if there are basic laws that are contravened by that, the Supreme Court wouldn't have the power to enforce that.
In his platform, the Supreme Court has no power whatsoever.
I believe in Smotrich's platform, the Supreme Court would have to have, in order for the Supreme Court to be able to overrule the government, you would have to have I think it was a full bench, all voting unanimously. Yes.
Does it have a constitution?
No.
Right?
It has basic laws which are like quasi-constitutional power, yeah.
But the Supreme Court's not necessarily democratic.
No, it's not democratic. Of course. Well, the Supreme Court. Well, courts are never democratic, right? A judiciary is not democratic.
Appointed by people who were elected
Right.
in the United States, and also the Attorney General does not work for the Supreme Court in the United States like it does in Israel.
Right. That's true. That's true. So, look, again, I don't think it's controversial. What you're saying is not controversial. I don't think it's controversial to say that there are constitutional reforms which would make things more democratic, or change the balance away from a too powerful Supreme Court. The criticism is that what Smotrich is doing moves things all the way to the other side, right? That's the critique. Okay, let's finish because it's it's late, and I wanted to give some time to Q&A. Just to say, this is a poll. Okay, this is the most recent poll I found. Let's just quickly play this out. All right, let's say these are the results. Okay? You can see, by the way, according to this poll, Jewish home and Balad are below the threshold. Both of them fall below the threshold, right? So in this scenario, Bibi falls just short. 60. He doesn't get to 61, right? Right? So if this were the result, Netanyahu is not going to be able to form a government. Which means that either someone else can, Lapid or Gantz, or we go to new elections. Right? Let's look at the alternative. Okay. So Yesh Atid, National Unity, Disoriented, Labour merits Ram. Okay, that's pretty much the coalition that we just had. It doesn't get to 60, 61, even less, 56. Now, could they get to 61? Let's think. If Gantz is right, and he can get the Haredim, then yes. But he'd have to get both of the Haredim if getting one of them means he loses Yisrael Beitenu, which is what Lieberman is saying, right? The other again, this is all speculation, as all of this is, but one of the scenarios, potential, is that members of the Likud. All right, I am going to finish there and take. It's 9:30. If people want to leave, by all means go. I'm happy to stay for another 10-15 minutes and take questions if people have questions. So anyone that needs to leave, Bavakasha, it's been great. You're coming, but I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to sit down. Actually, I'm not going to sit down because then I can't. You know what? I'm not going to sit down because I won't be able to be heard by the recording. Damn it. I'll collapse afterwards. Yeah. It's fine. You know what? It's fine. If I'm leaning, this is why.
What are the mechanics? In other words, let's say Jewish Home gets 1,000 votes.
Yeah.
They're tossed out. What happens to those 1,000 people?
Okay, it's a great question. So they get distributed They get distributed among the other parties. So what that means is let's say Likud have 32 seats, but they're like 100 seats away, 100 votes away from getting 33. They could get that 100 from the thing. Exactly, yes.
From whom?
He was saying if Jewish Home's votes are wasted. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that Israel fails as a democracy to the extent that if there are all these minor parties with fragmented interests, and you have your bloc which forms a coalition, there is no unified opposition. There's no real balance. In every other system, well, not every other system, most democratic systems, for example, in the UK, in Canada, in the US, you've got a very strong opposition as counterbalance. And here, it's so fragmented, I don't see that.
Yeah, so it's definitely true that you don't have a unified opposition because almost by definition, the opposition is made up of diverse parties. Actually, this last Knesset was unusual in that the coalition was so diverse that actually the opposition was unusually united. You had Bibi's bloc, and then you had the joint list as the outlier, right? You had this Arab party, but you had Bibi's bloc as the opposition. Yeah, it is true. I mean, I think that if you have a very capable opposition leader, and his party is pretty strong, or her party, then you can have Menachem Begin, by the way, and I should definitely say this given where we are. Menachem Begin was in the opposition for almost 30 years and was a very, very important opposition leader. You could even say that he defined the role of opposition in Israel in a very important way. He made it an important part of Israeli democracy in a way that someone else might not have done. Yes, sir.
Are there any politicians in Israel that are seriously considering changing the system to make it more representative, like in the United States, right. Congressman represents an area?
So every few years there are suggestions for changing the system. It hasn't happened. I mean, there have been changes made often changes that have made things worse. So the most famous case was the direct vote for Prime Minister, which ended up doing the opposite of what was intended. Now, there was the raising of the threshold, by the way, is supposed to make things more stable because you have fewer smaller parties. But there's a very interesting argument made by someone I interviewed recently on my Zoom, which was also in a Times of Israel article I read today, which is that it's made things worse because it's the... Bye. Thank you for your questions.
Okay, you're welcome. I'm still on.
Oh, fair enough. It's made things worse because it's the raising of the threshold which has caused this fixation on the threshold. The fact that on significant parties that could make a difference, like Jewish Home or the Arab parties, or even Meretz and Labour that could fall below the threshold theoretically, it's because the threshold is so high now that they have had to that has created this kind of fixation. So one of the charges in this piece today was that Netanyahu would not have gone to the lengths, would not have done the very controversial act for many people of essentially midwifing the merger of Otzma Yehudit and Jewish Home and religious Zionists, right? Basically bringing Ben Gvir out of the cold, out of pariah status, into the mainstream, for which Netanyahu was criticized. And this article says the reason he did that was because he was so terrified of losing these right-wing votes. And that wouldn't have been the case if you'd had a lower threshold. Then Ben Gvir's party would have gone into government, would have got into the Knesset. It would have had 2 seats. It would have been this insignificant, marginal, far-right party that no one would have had anything to do with. That was the argument. It's interesting. Yes, Lena.
I just came from a country, from Rishwan, and probably know more than others about how, whatever possible consequences when you're decreasing to a check and balance system. So, and probably it's kind of a general question, but what happened in Israeli society? How it came to be even possible to raise this question? What kind of changes occurred recently in Israeli society? Because as I understand, it wasn't the case even 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I'm trying to understand what kind of changes are happening here.
Oh wow! So let me repeat the question. Let me repeat the question. Also, I also made a mistake because I should have been repeating the questions anyway. Because I think because this is being recorded, not everyone would hear the questions. So I apologize for those of you watching the recording. So Lena asked, having come from Russia, a country in which checks and balances are not a thing, shall we say, on a very powerful executive. What has happened in Israeli society to create the situation where it might be the case that checks and balances are being removed? Because her argument is that she doesn't think that was always the case. So look, there's a very complicated answer to give, but basically I would say 2 things. Firstly, the Israeli system itself was not set up with a lot of checks and balances anyway. There's no written constitution. There's no second chamber in the Knesset. There's no House of Lords as you have in Britain, or Senate as you have in Canada, or House and Senate as you have in America. So there's no amending chamber. The executive, almost by definition, has a majority of the legislature. So there aren't many checks and balances built in anyway, and it did rely on the Supreme Court to some extent, and it also relied on a certain, I think what has changed is a kind of polarization in Israel, which was there in other times, but I think for specific windows of time, and maybe not in the very, enduring way that it now is, where you have similar to what you have in America, I guess, where people don't just see the other side as the opposition; they see them as the enemy almost, right? So, they see, and this kind of very oppositional politics, I think, has led to a breakdown in trust in the system, and it means that there's more of at least some people, those who are arguing for the Supreme Court to still have at least much of its power, would say that we desperately need that, because otherwise you could have an executive which runs roughshod over civil liberties or whatever.
When courts become more partisan,
Yes.
that leads to a greater pressure to take power away from them.
Right, exactly.
Lack of trust of them.
Right. So the other,
Checks and balances loses by that.
Right. So the gentleman here made a very good point about what happens. The flip side of that is that courts are seen to be too partisan, and therefore you want to take power away from them. Now, what happened in Israel in the 1990s was that the court became more powerful as a result of basic laws that were passed about, I don't want to go into too much detail, but essentially Israel, until the 1990s, Israel did not have in its basic laws, which are the kind of makeshift constitution, ad hoc constitution in Israel. There were not until the 1990s basic laws which spoke about rights, civil rights. There was no equivalent of a Bill of Rights, let's say. So you had these two basic laws passed which went some way to addressing that, talking about human dignity and rights, and certain rights. And these became enshrined in Israel's constitution, such as it is. And the Supreme Court interpreted these laws to mean that the Supreme Court could strike down legislation which contravened these basic rights. Now, for some people, that was much needed. For other people, that was massive overreach. So that sort of issue has continued to play out. And I think today, there is a debate about it. And I think that as I said, Gideon Sa'ar, who was justice minister in this government and also used to be a Likud justice minister, talked about reforms to the court, but he talked about it in the context of a wider reform of the constitution, which might, for example, create other checks and balances to compensate for losing some of the court's power. And the fear on that side of the aisle is that what the Netanyahu-Smotrich government would do would remove checks and balances and not replace them with anything. So that I think is the sort of debate that's going on. And I also think it's seen in a wider international context, where you have countries where democratically elected leaders have really sort of drip destroyed the liberal democracies in their countries through that kind of thing. So people are seeing it as that's why I mentioned Hungary, that's the fear. Yeah.
Just a comment. I want to congratulate you and commend you on your neutrality in the presentation.
Thank you very much. That was, you didn't have a question. That was just a comment. Okay. So I very much. It was a question. Was I neutral? No, I very much appreciate it. Thank you. It's actually it is difficult, but I've done this a few times, so I'm kind of used to it by now. And so far no one has come to me and said, "How dare you say that about this party or that?" So I guess I've done okay. Yeah. So.
Sorry, can I just get clarification again about if a party does not reach threshold at the time of elections, and then some of the votes will then go to.
So they're distributed among the other parties. So
how is that distribution decided?
It's a basically equal distribution, but it doesn't. But depending on how close a party is to getting another seat, it could make a difference or not, right? If someone has 10 seats and they're like 20,000 votes away from getting another seat, then those extra votes aren't going to help them.
Sorry, so it's divided by proportion or it's divided equally? Like if Netanyahu is got 25%, he gets 25% of the
No. It's divided. No. It's just. Yeah. It's like. Yeah. Like if there were. I mean, this is obviously totally spurious. But if a party got 120 votes, then each party. No, sorry, that's wrong. If there were 13 parties and if a party got 13 votes, then it would be one each. Yeah.
It could be unfair.
In what sense?
I, who voted for this party.
Of course. No, oh yeah, for sure. Of course, absolutely. But and of course, the reason why the threshold was raised was because they hoped it would deter people. It would deter people from voting for smaller parties, because they would say, "Don't vote for the smaller party because you're gonna waste your votes." The problem is, of course, that you end up with very well established, serious parties with a lot of very, whether you agree with them or not, professional, well-intentioned people like Jewish Home or Meretz or whatever, who could lose out because the threshold is so high. Yes.
I read a lot about the difference of views on the maritime agreement, and Bibi, but are any of the other parties actively calling one a greatest thing and the other calling it a tragedy, or is it just the politics of Bibi versus Lapid?
Look, I think that the agreement was put to a vote in the cabinet, and everyone except Shaked voted in favour of it. So, including Bennett. So all the parties in the coalition pretty much voted in favour of it. Netanyahu has come out very strongly against it, as you said, and people can judge whether he's just playing politics or whether he has a genuine case. And I don't think many other people have come. But I think it's mainly I'm sure if you ask someone on Netanyahu's side, they'd agree with Netanyahu because it's an election. Yeah.
It is the first time in Israel history that Israeli sovereignty over land has been conceded without a Knesset vote. It went with a cabinet vote, which means the opposition wasn't represented.
But it's not land.
It's water.
It's water.
It's water.
No, but right. But this is key. The legal argument, and I think there are legal arguments. I think people have different legal opinions. But one of the legal opinions is that a maritime border is not the same as a land border. Well, this is a legal argument. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to comment. Yes.
I may have missed this, but does National Unity have a clear agenda platform besides being anti-Netanyahu and Gideon Saar's opinions on court? Okay,
that's a fair question. So I think their position is, firstly, with all these parties, if you like, they have most of them, including I think that party, have platforms on their websites. Some of them in English, but those that not, you could like always Google Translate. So the specifics I'm not going to be able to give you. I was look, they are closer to SAR. Blue and White didn't really have a platform that was so distinct, right? It was very much about the personality of Gantz. To be fair, SAR did have a pretty substantial, I would say, sort of centre-right platform as New Hope, which I think has largely been adopted by this new party. By the way, I didn't say this, but one of the reasons why this issue of two states, where Saar and Gantz might disagree, is kind of moot, or is kind of not so, let's not say two states, but the issue of the territories is that one of the big divisions is this question of annexation, right? Whether Israel should annex parts of or all of Judea and Samaria. And that whole question was put on hold by the Abraham Accords. So when Bibi signed the Abraham Accords, part of the agreement was that annexation is off the table for a number of years. So before the last election, Gideon Saar was asked about this, and he said, "I would love to annex. Like I'm more of an annexationist than Bibi is, but I will respect the agreement that Netanyahu made." Right? So to an extent, so these kinds of issues are sort of like conveniently off the table for certain reasons. Okay. Are we done?
Just a quick...
oh, go for it.
About what you said about the agreement with Lebanon, about
the maritime thing, yeah.
I think what makes it more complicated is not the issue that whether it went to a vote in the Knesset or not,
Yeah.
which is the problem.
Yes.
Is the fact that it was signed by a government which is a transitional government.
Right, this was very controversial.
So this, to me, is more of a problem, because 2 weeks from now, let's say, well, whenever the election be, just assume that that vote went in a month from now, you might have a completely different government.
Yeah.
And you might not sign the agreement. So I think that's a problem that people have to understand that it's a commitment by a traditional government, which is really not.
Yeah, a lot of people. Yeah, this is what a lot of people have raised that. So this was one of the things that the Attorney General ruled on, and ruled that it could be done, and people said that's not. Yeah, it was controversial. I agree with you. I mean, just a devil's advocate, you could say that even if you didn't have a transitional government, even if you had like a regular, fully, stable government, could make an agreement, and then the next government that replaces it could change it. Even if it was a stable government. So the fact that it's a transitional government doesn't really change that.
By definition, a transitional government is not really a fully legitimate from the voting perspective, from the voter. It's
definitely the point of view you're raising is a point of view that has been raised by many people. You're right. Yes. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Bye bye. Thank you.